hounds, chase ghosts, come sleep, watch out, demons are coming, run, sleep, hide, spirits, ghosts, hide, demons, hounds, ghosts, demons are coming, spirits, ghosts.
Welcome home, my little hellhounds. Tonight we have 3 creepy stories posted by subscribers. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe if you're new, as this really helps the channel. And if you have any creepy stories you want read out on the channel, then submit them to Reddit r/homeofscares. Now let's get right into it. Forever 40, posted by MTP6921. My wife Gina and I never have time for anything. My wife is an event planner for baptisms, weddings, bar mitzvahs at a local golf club, which has to be one of the most stressful jobs in the country. People are just so demanding and critical, and everything has to be right. As the manager of a Philadelphian hotel, I am equally as busy as my wife Gina, and it seems getting through a day is almost a miracle at times. Every time the house gets cleaned, it seems, by the next day it's just a big mess again. With our Civil War era built house, repairs are always inevitable, and it's so hard to get away from being the 8 ball. It seemed like Gina and I never have time to spend together, and once again, Christmas time is close again. The one thing Gina and I looked forward to was going to the local Christmas tree farm to cut down our own Christmas tree. The same nice man, Gus, is there every year, and he hasn't raised his prices in all the years we have been going. We continued our Black Friday tradition by seeing Gus as we had done so the previous years. He's such a nice man, and based on only charging $10 a tree, he definitely isn't doing it for the money. We borrowed one of his saws, and after careful deliberation, we cut down the right tree. We drove home and put the tree up and decorated the tree with the same ornaments we had for years. It seemed like Christmas time had flew by once again, and on the day after Christmas we have decided to put in new composite flooring in the living room. I always liked the original wood flooring that was over 100 years old, but there was too much wear and tear, and we needed to replace it. I decided that I was going to remove the flooring, so plank by plank I started to remove each piece of wood. The basement was thick, original log beams that are about as thick and round as a railroad tie. As I continued to remove the wood planks, I came across an old 35mm projector with rolls of film. Though I wanted to get the job done of removing the old flooring, I was just so curious to know what was on the film reels. I plugged the old projector in the dining room and closed the window shades. The process of setting up the film was a real pain, but I finally got the machine to work. As the machine ran, I was left speechless in what I was watching. It was the two of us, Gina and I, where we were just sitting by the Christmas tree. The quality of the film looked to be from around the late 1960s to early 1970s. I couldn't stop thinking about who took these videos and how did they get the film to look so old. As I continued to watch the film, it dawned on me that Gina and I were always just so busy trying to keep our heads above water that I didn't pay attention to the years that had gone past. I tried to think how old I was, and I had stopped counting once I hit 40. Then I tried to think about Gina's age, and the same was true, where I couldn't come up with a number. Gina had a heartbreaking stillbirth, and we decided to try again and forego having children. As long as we were busy, the two of us didn't think about the stillbirth or the fact we didn't have kids. Gina was upstairs rearranging her closet, and I yelled for her to come and watch the film. She had the same impression that I had, and then we both had that aha moment. The both of us realised that both of us have been so occupied to keeping our heads above water over the years that we didn't realise that we haven't got any older. We both looked at each other and I said, "We're both 40 something, right?" Gina looked at me and said, "Yeah, but 40 what?" We were both only children whose parents were deceased. Both of our jobs were notorious for having constant turnaround, so both of us couldn't say we worked with someone for 10 years. The both of us were just completely befuddled. I knew about every 5 years we would get a new used car, and generally the latest technology regarding our phones, but we just hadn't put two and two together, that we were kind of stuck at whatever age that we are now. I asked Gina, "What year were you born?" She paused and said, "I don't know." Then she asked me, "What year were you born?" I responded the same, "I just don't know." I remember playing outside as a kid, but anything beyond that was foggy. I'd been working in the historic Bellevue Stratford Hotel for so long that that's all I could really remember. Gina basically said the same thing, with working in the Philadelphia Golf Club. We both talked to each other and came to the conclusion that we were just purposely kept ourselves busy so we wouldn't think about not having kids, not having family, and not getting older. We really didn't have any friends, and any conversations we had at work were just work related. Both of our jobs had multiple new owners over the years, and we kind of just went along with the flow. If I hadn't come across this old 35mm film projector, then Gina and I would never have had this discussion, which led to a discussion on how we never discuss anything. The two of us just roll with the times. We never travel. We only take off for Christmas, and our money just goes into a bank account. This was the first time in maybe decades that we actually had stopped to talk to each other. I said, "What year is it?" Gina replied, "I don't know, 2000 and something." I responded, "What did we do for 1999? Gina responded, "You know, we both worked." Then I said, "What about 89, 79, 1969 or 1959? We both looked at each other, puzzled. I answered my own question with, "We just both worked." I then said, "What year did you have the stillbirth?" Gina broke down, hysterically crying. It was like I brought up something that should never be brought up. I tried to think to myself and realised that the stillbirth was so traumatic that I kind of blocked it out, where it was just a foggy memory. Then I looked at the old flooring and had a jolt of something that went through my brain. I remembered laying down the same flooring well over 100 years ago. I said, "Gina, how can this be? We have lived through everything from not having electricity to having electricity to driving horses and then cars, and it just happened." Gina said, "Yeah, everything just happened." I was always in the age gap where I was at first too young to fight in the war. Then I hit that cut-off 40-something where I was just too old. We had seen house after house being built in our Bucks County community, but we just never questioned anything. Much like our rectangular shaped house, we just existed. Nobody stops to look at a pebble and says, "Wow, I have seen that pebble every day for years," because it's just there, much like Gina and I. As the film ended, Gina asked me, "So, what does this mean now?" I replied, "I don't know." I put the old projector back where I found it, and I decided to put the old flooring back. Without having kids, Gina and I never bothered to take pictures of each other. Our parents died so long ago that pictures weren't readily available. The thought of the stillbirth put both of us back in the trance-like states where we just went back to work the next day, and we kind of knew what we had to do in order to not think about our lifeless baby. So much so that the year had come and went again, and we were ready to get another tree for Christmas. We drove to Gus's tree farm and Gus greeted us. I couldn't stop thinking about the year before when I discovered the 35mm film, and Gina and I discovered that we couldn't think how old we were. I greeted Gus by saying, "Hey Gus, how did the year go for you?" Gus replied, "Busy as usual." I remembered Gus's wife, who used to work with him and then unfortunately passed away some time ago. The only time I see Gus is during Christmas time when we get the tree. Much like the pebble, most people don't pay attention to Gus, and most people just get their tree in whatever temporary parking lot, tree stand that props up. I then said, "Hey Gus, how many years have Gina and I been coming here?" Gus stopped and he said, "I'm really not sure." I then said, "Do you think it was 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years?" Gus kind of looked at me and said, "It's just something that I just don't think about." I then said, "Well, how many trees have you been tending to? The Christmas trees and selling them?" He looked at me and said, "Geez, I really don't know. I'm not sure what year it really is right now." I then said, "I remember your wife when she used to work with you." Then Gus kind of blanked out for the last 30 seconds. It seemed like he did everything possible to not think about his wife who died. Gus gradually regained his attention and seemed to have a thought and said, "Yeah, I remember my wife died about the same year your wife was pregnant." The two 18-year-old men who went missing on Hill 677, posted by MTP6921. I was 17 years old when I was sent to Europe to fight the Germans in 1945. I really wanted more than anything to be involved in the war. I was from a small rural town in Nova Scotia, Canada, where the only things I knew was poverty and boredom. So I did everything possible to join the war. I was sent over in February of 1945, and Germany surrendered in May of 1945. I only got a small taste of what war was like, even though I was put with the elite Canadian Special Forces, also known as the Devil's Brigade. The only time I shot my rifle was during boot camp training. It was still exciting, and it felt like I became a man overnight when I took my first steps in Germany. After the war, I remained in the Canadian Reserves, more or less to get a monthly paycheck. I would have never thought that Canada would be trusted into another conflict after devastation of World War II, but I was dead wrong. I remember reading the newspaper headlines of a possible conflict in the Koreas. I really wanted no part of it. I had a very small taste of war and I didn't want any more of it. However, the Canadian government had other plans for me and they sent me to Korea in 1951. There was no fanfare or luster like there was for World War II. In addition to being in the Army Reserves, I had a good job with the Canadian National Railway, where I had a young wife and a nice house. When I got the deployment letter, all I could think about was living in a tent with horrible food. It was actually much worse than I thought it would be. This time at 23 years old, I was the elder, surrounded by young kids. I remember there were two 18-year-old Canadians who looked as fierce as puppy dogs. The one kid's name was Stan Murphy and the other was Charles Johnson. They were both from the same province of Nova Scotia as me, though I didn't know them before the Korean War. With my 3 months of World War II experience, I was considered the hardened veteran. We were stationed on a hill in Kapyong, known as Hill 677. One night we were thrown into heavy fighting with the North Koreans and the Chinese armies. I remembered continuously yelling at Stan and Charles to keep shooting. The enemy seemed to have an endless supply of men to throw at us. To this day, every time I watch a zombie movie, I get flashbacks, because, like the zombies, the enemy would continually come at us. As the onslaught continued, I had my bayonet affixed to my rifle. The enemy would run right into our machine guns. They just wouldn't withdraw. They had breached our line, and I thrusted my bayonet into the torso of 3 different enemy combatants. There was no training that could have prepared me for the sheer horror of that night. We killed hundreds, if not thousands of them, and we were considered victorious. As daylight came, I was so exhausted that I could barely move, and there was no rejoicing for me, because both Charles and Stan were missing. I was happy to be alive, but I felt like a complete failure. I let the wolves get the 2 sheep. I searched for hours for them after the enemy retreated. The last time I saw them, they were both alive. They were no more than 50 yards from me to my left. It didn't make sense, and it haunted me for years, because I couldn't get past the inevitable conclusion that the 2 of them were probably taken by the enemy. I heard horror stories after the war, what happened to captured Canadians, and all I could think was, hopefully they were executed quickly. Every day I relived the horrors of that night, so much so that I decided that the only way I was going to get closure was if I went back to Korea and tried to find out for myself what happened to those 2 young guys. I felt I could do more on my own than relying on the government bureaucracy. I inherited my father's gift of the gab since I was a young child, and even with my limited ability to speak Korean, I had made some personal connections with a few of the South Koreans who fought alongside us during the war. I had kept in touch with one of the Korean soldiers named Sunbuk Kim via letters over the years. He had actually become the governor of the Gyeonggi province, where the Battle of Kapyong was fought. Sunbuk later learned that the retreating North Korean army may have taken South Korean captors to Pyongyang to be tortured. He didn't hear of any rumours of Canadians being taken as prisoners, but I thought to myself, if they took South Koreans, then why wouldn't they have taken Canadians? Sunbuk told me he would discuss it more with me when I arrived in South Korea, because he didn't feel comfortable writing about Stan and Charles. I decided to take the costly flight in 1995 with the layovers and everything else. It took me 45 hours to get from Halifax to the Gyeonggi province. I was greeted by Sunbuk at the Gyeonggi airport. Fortunately, his English had improved since the last time I saw him in the early 1950s, especially considering I haven't heard the Korean language since the war. We hugged each other like we were brothers who hadn't seen each other in over 40 years. He took me to see the Battle of Kapyong memorial statue. I started crying immediately when I saw Hill 677. Though the hill was nothing more than overgrown vegetation, I could still remember the dead bodies being strewn everywhere in 1951. Sunbuk took me to his house, where I meet his entire family, to include his wife and kids and even his parents. When his family went to sleep, him and I sat at his dining room table to discuss the current situation. He told me that the South Koreans have spies in North Korea that even the Canadians and Americans don't know about. He told me he was willing to help me sneak across the North Korean border, and we would be disguised as North Korean peasants. Being 5'8" tall was a disadvantage because most of the North Korean males were really short from being malnourished. I had red hair and looked like the poster child for a Caucasian, so my whole head had to be concealed in peasant garbs, and I had to keep my head down the whole time. We would go along with 2 other South Korean guides who knew the way to get into North Korea, and they had connections there as well. We would walk to the outskirts of Pyongyang, North Korea, from the Gyeonggi province, which was about 50 miles. It is late October and the weather is in the 30 degrees Fahrenheit at night. It took us 5 days to traverse the Korean hills. We had a lot of supplies we were carrying with us, which were mostly bribes that were going to be used to get across the border and then hopefully used to get additional information on the fate of Charles and Stan. I could see a remote North Korean guard station. There were signs posted everywhere warning that anyone who unlawfully passes the border would be executed. The signs really scared the crap out of me. I did think of the possibility that I was unknowingly being sold to the North Koreans. However, at this point there was no turning around. 2 guides gave one of the guards in charge nearly 10 pounds of chocolate, which was considered an absolute delicacy in North Korea considering the country was so poor. Sunbuck told me that if the guards knew I was Canadian, then they would, without a doubt, take me as prisoner, because they would be considered utmost heroes for capturing a mortal enemy. We purposely put about 30 yards between us and the guards as I crossed the North Korean border, and I kept my head down the whole time. Luckily, I made it past the guard station. There were 3 guards who were much more interested in the chocolate than watching us pass the border. We walked another 10 miles to an unknown village. 2 guides had an agent spy contact in the village. We met the North Korean spy in an old abandoned hut in the unknown village. It was something right out of the movies. I was both nervous beyond belief and excited as well. The 2 South Korean guides gave the spy 5 Dell laptop computers, which were impossible to get in North Korea. Each laptop had classified information on them as well. Sunbuck told me the spy would need a week to try to get information about the demise of Charles and Stan. The 4 of us stayed in the abandoned hut for the week. It wasn't heated, so I was cold during the day and even colder at night. Sunbuck and I killed time by reminiscing about the war and the aftermath. This is the 7th day and the spy hasn't returned. We are starting to get concerned if the spy is coming back. You never know for sure if the spy is a double agent, and at any time we could be taken away by the North Korean army. The 2 guides assure us and tell Sunbuck in Korean to wait 2 more days. It had to be about 3 AM on the 9th day when the spy came into the abandoned hut. He talked to 3 other men and Sunbuck translated what he said for me. Sunbuck said he was able to find information about your missing comrades who disappeared in 1951. I respond, "Oh really, what did he find out?" Sunbuck replied, "Our secret agent has photos that he got from a family in a village on the other side of Pyongyang." I responded, "That's crazy." And then the agent took out the photos. Sunbuck said, "These black and white photos are them in the 1950s. I almost fainted when I saw the photograph. They looked thin and emaciated, but at least they were alive." The agent pulled out more photos and gave more information, which Sunbuck translated. The 2 men endured insufferable cruelty for a decade. Then in the mid-60s, the dictator allowed the men to assimilate in a small village. This is highly unusual, and the reason for this is unknown. The agent spy took out more photos which showed the two men having female partners. I was absolutely amazed at what I was seeing, but nothing prepared for what I saw next, which were photos of the two men's children. I kept saying, "Oh my gosh, oh my gosh," over and over again. Based on the photos, it looked like Stan had one daughter and Charles had two sons. The kids looked of mixed race, where the Korean features were more dominant. In a low, somber tone, Sunbuk said, "Unfortunately, the two men had died in the late 80s. They both had liver and other problems from years of severe malnourishment when they were held captive by the North Korean army. My mind was a roller coaster of emotions. Part of me was saddened to hear about their deaths, and another part of me was happy to hear they actually lived and actually had children. I wasn't allowed to take the photos. If this information made the national news, then Stan's and Charles' kids, and whatever family he made here in North Korea, would be executed by the dictator. We waited for sunrise and we started the trek back towards South Korea. I felt a sense of relief that I finally got closure on the two young men who vanished on Hill 677 one night in 1951. The walk back was effortless, partly because we had less weight we were carrying because we had given away our bribes, and also I was constantly in thought about how much my life has changed after being stationed here during the war. We made it back to South Korea. Then the next morning I went to the airport to return home. I was beyond grateful to Sunbuk, the two guides and the agent for the help and assistance they had given me. I knew there was one thing I had to do when I got back home. Charles' mother was still alive and both Stan's parents were still alive. The three of them were elderly and were living close to Halifax. I had to convince them not to share the story with anyone for fear of their grandchildren's lives. I figured the right thing to do was to give closure to Charles and Stan's living parents and tell them of their son's demise. Both of them were still considered missing in action. To be honest, it was beyond my wildest beliefs that Stan and Charles had actually survived that night and lived up to the late 80s. I told the parents on 2 different occasions, and on first meeting with Charles's mother, she was so shell-shocked with glee that she was speechless when I left, which was the same for both of Stan's parents, which I met the next day. I had never seen anyone so shocked when I told their parents. It was like the part of their brains that had been closed off with despair for so many years was finally awakened with news that 3 of them would never have expected. I find myself now coming to grips with my experiences on the hill in Kapyong known as Hill 677. I will never be normal, but at least I'm a little less haunted by the disappearances of the two young men on one night in 1951. Letting Go, posted by J. Rubus. Letting go is hard, even when you didn't think it would be. J. Michaels passed at the rain-sluiced window overlooking the spacious backyard of his Cape Cod on Beverick Street, a broad residential avenue in the heart of Albany's Pine Hills neighbourhood. The grass, fed by days of precipitation, was bright green, putting him, for some reason, in mind of Ireland, a place he'd never visited and knew nothing about, and grey clouds churned ominously overhead. A 7-foot-high wood stockade fence, splintered by years and the elements, denoted the edge of his property. Beyond it, the neighbour's house was dark, the curtains hanging in what he assumed was the attic window, even though the sash was clearly closed. Was someone watching him? They're like family. It's natural to feel this way. You'd be a cold-hearted son of a bitch if you didn't. He walked back to his desk and glanced down at the drawing he'd been working on. A girl, 14, with a jaunty ponytail held in place by a dull purple scrunchie, sat with her knobbly knees drawn to her flat chest, her mouth a squiggle of misery and tears streaming down her sunken face. Blood seeped from a ragged wound along her left wrist, and the gleaming kitchen knife jutted from her right hand, its blade dusky and crusted red. The scene sent a ripple of horror through Jay, and he whipped his gaze from it, a knot pulsing deep in the centre of his stomach. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe he should keep the series going. It paid the bills after all, and people liked it, despite what he thought just a month ago. He liked it. No, with a sigh, he went back to the window and looked out at the backyard again. The curtains across the way moved. He squinted, and his stomach lurched. Was that a Lulu Roswell-shaped shadow on the fabric? He tittered nervously. Of course it wasn't. It was. He didn't know. But it couldn't be her. She wasn't real. She felt that way sometimes, as all of his characters did, but she was a drawing, lines and angles and shading, nothing more. Nevertheless, his disquiet intensified. He went back to the desk and looked at the drawing once more. Was her head tilted farther back than it had been? Were her eyes watching him a little more directly? He ran his fingers through his brown hair and took a deep breath. He slipped a pack of Newports from the breast pocket of his work shirt, shook one out and lit it. Inhaling deeply, he pushed it out in a narrow plume and returned to the window like a restless captain plotting a life or death voyage to nowhere. It was a drawing, God damn it. Why did he feel so guilty? Why did he feel like he was betraying her? She and the others had been good to him. They built this house and furnished everything in it, and this was how he repaid them. A humorless laugh barked from his throat. Fiction. They were fiction, Jesus. But fiction is sometimes more real than reality. Fiction, Jay had learned, was a refuge from the horror, cruelty and banality of daily life. He hadn't he himself spent hours, days, even weeks focusing on something that wasn't real in order to avoid the things that were. He was reminded of a meme he saw on Facebook once. A dog sitting at a kitchen table with a cup of coffee in front of it and flames consuming its surroundings. "This is fine," the dog said, delusional. That was him. It was a lot of people, the geeks he met at conventions, the ones who asked for his autograph and treated him like he was the second coming. They lost themselves in the Roswell family as a way of escaping their social awkwardness, escaping their overbearing mothers, escaping the rigours of their autism or low self-esteem. The most powerful thing about fiction is that it can consume us if we let it. The way the Roswell family consumed him. The curtains moved and a fearful shudder went through him. He created the Roswell family in college as a joke. This big, dysfunctional brood rife with incest, sadism, fart jokes, gore and social commentary that seemed biting and clever to him when he was 20, but made him cringe now. Somewhere along the way, through a freak stroke of fate, the Roswell family found a home in the underground comics scene, and he managed, like Manson and Koresh before him, to dupe a bunch of people into thinking he was something entire career. His entire life was staked on that goddamn series now. Last year, as he started inking the annual Christmas special, a revelation hit him like a sniper's bullet. He hated the comic. He hated the characters' stupid faces. He hated their stupid names, their stupid house. Hell, he even hated the way they were drawn. Somewhere between The Simpsons and Family Guy, but with more rounded, kid-friendly edge. The design of an amateur, desperately trying to hide his imperfections. He wanted to focus on the other stories, other projects, but the fucking Roswells stood in his way. It's what the people wanted. It's what the publisher wanted. And to be honest, it was safe. It made money, and he knew he could do it. Every month, he held his nose and crapped out a new issue, sent it to his publisher and collected a check. Once in a blue moon, he would do a convention where he greeted fans, signed stupid merchandise, and bristled every time someone referred to him as the Roswell guy. Finally, he had enough and started on the final story arc. It was scary. He approached it with a mixture of exhilaration and dread. Just a few more and he'd be free. He could start on one of the other ideas he had. As he worked out, however, he started getting scared that the Roswell family was a fluke and that he'd never do anything else worthwhile again. Scared he would be lost without the series. He felt like a child letting go of his mother's hand. He was alone now, on his own, and the safety and success of the Roswell family was on the horizon, glistening, beckoning, come back. As he neared the end, he started feeling nostalgic. He'd been drawing the characters, especially Lulu, in one form or another since he was a child. They really were like family, and leaving your family was hard. Still, it had to be done. He needed to grow as an artist, to give voice to many, many stories within. He didn't hate the Roswell family. He realized he resented it. As D-Day approached, even the resentment began to fade, replaced by good memories, smiles, and warm feelings. It would be safer to keep with it, easier. The series paid his bills. The people liked it. He could keep doing it forever and live a decent life. He couldn't say that about whatever lie ahead. Part of an artist is taking risks and experimenting, though once an artist falls into a rut, they might as well be dead. There was a lot on his mind that day, so he wasn't too surprised when he dreamed of Lulu. In the dream, he was staggering through a maze of shadowy corridors, desperately trying to find an exit. When he finally came to a door and threw it open, Lulu Roswell blocked his path, tall and freckled, with messy brown hair, brown eyes, and soft features. She looked different than she did when he drew her, somehow more alive. "Where are you going?" she asked, plaintively, her lips quivering. He fell back a step, but Lulu didn't move. "Why are you leaving?" At that moment, Jay felt a surge of love for her, but hatred as well. He wanted to go to her, hug her, and never let her go. But a part of him wanted to knock the bitch out of the way. "You can't leave," she stomped her foot and balled her fists. "You have to stay." "I can't," he said. "I have to go." She was trembling, her face flushed. When she spoke, she spit. "You can't leave me. You can't, you can't, you can't." She threw herself at him, her hands bent into talons, and he woke, panting and covered in sweat. For a long time, he lay away, thinking. He felt terrible about leaving Lulu. The hurt look in her eyes tore him apart. "She's a cartoon character, get with it, huh?" He laughed. Yeah, it was 4:49 a.m. when he got up and went into his studio to finish off the current issue. It was just past dawn when he wrote "Finish" on the final one. Before the last arch. Now, after 10 long years, he was there, poised on the precipice of a new day. Just a few more strokes of the pen and it would all be over. J. Michaels would be free. That first night, after waking from the dream, he went downstairs like a man in the grip of somnambulism. intending to get a drink from the kitchen, but taking a heavy hard-back book down from a shelf in the living room and sitting on the couch by a warm lamplight glow. He spent 3 hours lazily and relishingly paging through the Roswell Family Super Pack Volume 1, which collected the first 20 issues of the comic, a heartwarming family sitcom with dark secrets. The description on the inside cover read, "The Roswell Family was intended to be a send-up of those corny old TV sitcoms Jay grew up on: Growing Pains, Boy Meets World, Roseanne, the ones packed with life lessons and the power of familial love. Only the Roswells were different. They were crazy, every single one of them. The main character, 12-year-old Billy, was a violent fire starter. Lulu was a psychopath who secretly longed for him. The parents were burnouts, and the other kids, 1 boy and 3 girls, had their own problems. Sibling arguments weren't resolved peacefully. They turned into knockdown, drag-out bloodbaths. No one helped or supported one another. They threw them under the bus whenever the chance presented itself, and people regularly died. It was so witty, so humorous when he was 19. Now it was just sad, embarrassing even. Over time, Lulu became the de facto main character simply because he found her so interesting. She was mean-spirited, hateful, obsessive, and deep down hurting. He smiled fondly as he went over his work. At the end of the book, however, his smile dropped. The last page, which had been blank, now continued a picture of Lulu, her hands balled at her side, a look of rage on her face. Her eyes, Jesus, her eyes saw him, and in them was hatred. Blinking, he closed the book and then opened it again. The picture was gone. If it had ever been there. You can't leave. Presently, Jay stubbed the cigarette out with shaky fingers and glanced down at Lulu's upturned face. She was watching him. When he started the picture, her head was hung in contrition. Now her gaze met his head on. She no longer looked miserable. She looked furious. Imagination. It was just his imagination. Even so, he stared down at the page, certain that she would move if he just looked long enough. How could you do this to me? He almost heard her say. He shouldn't feel the shame and guilt that he was. But could you blame him? Lulu was his first. The first character he ever drew that didn't look like crap. The first one he named. The first that brought him money. They had a lot of history together. She was always there for him, no matter what. Friends and family came and went, but Lulu endured. Fucking Christ, knock it off. Alright, okay, this was harder than he thought it would be, and he was trying to adapt. That's all. Soon he'd be fine. Only he wasn't. She consumed his every waking thought, appeared in his every dream. Sometimes, as he sat bent over the final issues. He could almost feel her presence. Lulu glared up at him, and he looked back. What was that saying about staring into the abyss too long and becoming a monster? "Don't leave me," she said, and for a long moment he wavered, then sat back down, intending to finish this once and for all. In this story arc, Lulu had finally seduced her brother into bed, but he rejected her in favour of a girl from school. Lulu, never all together to begin with, snapped, kidnapped the interloper, and killed her with a hatchet. Then, soaked in blood and panting, she came for Billy, hacking down his bedroom door and cleaving his head in two. Now she sat in a spooky closet and the end of a spookier hall, bleeding, crying, the cold shadow of death stealing rapidly over her. There was something wrong with her, and Jay's stomach turned. Her eyes were too real, the torment too sharp. He took a pen and scribbled them out. He sat the current scene aside and quickly sketched the final panel. A long shot of the closet door, the sound of soft weeping drifting down the shadowy corridor. He was shaking when he finished. He quickly resketched the scene of Lulu, with the knife working in a mindless frenzy. Done. He went over it, wedged between boxes of Christmas decorations and old books, lips quivering and tears streaming down her face. Lulu Roswell watched him, hurt, fear and anger in her big brown eyes. He loved her as though she were his own daughter, and seeing her like this pierced his heart. He was going to miss not writing her. God, how he would, but he couldn't spend the rest of his life doing it. Like a whirlwind affair, they were through, even if love still lingered. "I'm sorry," he found himself whispering. Mentally and emotionally drained, he got up and went into the living room, laying on the couch and watching the 12 o'clock news. He tried to doze, but his mind kept turning to poor, pretty, spunky little Lulu dying alone in a closet, her hopes, dreams and love shattered around her. How could he do that to her? "She's a fucking cartoon," he muttered, and the croaking of his own voice startled him. Just a cartoon, only a cartoon. No, she was more than that. She was him and he was her, just like all his characters. "Drop it." Jay sighed and actively tried to push her out of his mind. It must have worked temporarily, because his lids grew heavy and he drifted off to sleep. But like the cat in the nursery rhyme, she came back. In his dream, he was trapped in ice. He struggled, fought, but he could not break free. He resigned himself to death, but somehow he was free. Wind-driven snow lashed him. He started staggering into the gathering gloom, and that's when he heard her. "I'm coming for you." Jay glanced over his shoulder, head down, teeth bared. Lulu Roswell, caked in blood, was stalking after, an axe in her hands. Screaming, he started running, slipping on the ice and nearly falling. Behind him, Lulu came deliberately on. her stride unhurried, as though she were sure of capturing her prey eventually. The sheet of ice ended abruptly, and Jay found himself struggling through knee-deep snow. He was panicking, every step slow and heavy. Somehow, he was suddenly inside a house. Shadows pulled like ink. The front door bursts off its hinges, and Lulu was there, only it wasn't her. It was something else. Its face was dog-like, with a protruding snout and beady eyes. Fangs rimmed a small puckered mouth. Jay bounded up the stairs. At the top, he followed a dark passageway to a door. He opened it. Lulu Roswell greeted him. "You aren't going to leave me, are you?" she asked. Jay fell back. She followed her finger, sternly jabbing at his chest. "I made you. I'm the only reason you aren't living in your mother's basement. I'm all you have. You can't leave me." She grabbed him by the shirt, screaming. Jay came awake. A dream, only a dream. Panting, he flopped back onto the couch. Twilight filled the room. She was right, she made him. Without her, he was nothing. Bullshit, no. Above him a floorboard creaked, and Jay's blood turned to ice. For a moment, nothing. Then the sound of muffled footsteps. Then a door opening and softly clicking shut. Jay sat shakily up. She was here. God help him. Lulu Roswell was in the house. No, that couldn't be. Lulu Roswell wasn't real. But what if she was? What if he made her real? And now she was here to keep him from leaving her. "You can't leave." Jay licked his lips. No noise came from upstairs. Moving slowly, he got up and crossed the living room, heart pounding in his throat. At the foot of the stairs, he paused and looked up. Inky blackness held sway. He was just about to take the first step when a hitching sob echoed down the hall. A jolt of fright crackled through Jay's spirit, and the air left his lungs in a rush. This couldn't be happening. He was dreaming, or crazy, or something. Another sob came, this one sharper, full of woe and mourning, tugging his heartstrings, even as it chilled his blood. Dreaming or not, insane or not, Lulu Roswell was up there. For a long moment he stood there, one foot on the bottom step and his hand clutching the smooth oak railing. The only sound, the roar of blood crashing against his temples. Then, as if propelled by some outside force, he started up, treads moaning underfoot. Creak, creak, creak. He winced with each one, but didn't stop, couldn't stop. Unseen hands pulled him to the top, drawing him into the grainy darkness like temptations of evil. At the head of the stairs he paused. Ahead, a closet door that had never been there stared back at him. The hall looked different, darker, greyer, black and white. Unfamiliar rooms flanked him on either side, and a rag doll lay in the middle of the carpet, looking up at him with a frozen smile. A demon inviting him to play, if he dared. With a start he realised exactly where he was. The second floor of the Roswell house. Soft, miserable weeping drifted through the void, and Jay's spine tingled. His mind screamed at him to turn and flee, but his traitorous feet carried him forth. The crying, muffled, became louder, more urgent. Standing now on the other side of the door, hyperventilating with terror, he could hear Lulu Roswell's breathing, her snotty sniffles. His creation, his child, was in there, waiting. He opened the door, and his heart dropped. Lulu Roswell sat wedged in between stacks of boxes. Her legs were drawn to her chest. She was hugging herself, rocking back and forth. She wasn't a drawing now, she was real, flesh, blood and bone. When she looked up at him, her big brown eyes shimmering with tears, the breath ran out of him and he felt faint. Her face was a mottled, bloodless white and pink rimmed. Her two big eyes, real or not, living or not, she didn't look right. Her proportions, those of a cartoon. Her head, too rounded and crinked on one side, lending it the appearance of a kidney bean. Her eyes over large, her mouth straight and lipless. Dizzy and weak-kneed, Jay grabbed the doorknob in an effort to keep his balance. "Why?" she lisped and sniffled. "Why are you leaving me?" Jay opened his mouth, but no words came, no thoughts came, nothing but a rasping wheeze. The edges of his vision strained and his skull pulsed as though it were going to explode. "Why are you leaving me? Don't you love me anymore?" I have to," Jay heard himself say. "No, you don't. You can write about me forever. You know you can. You just don't want to." He opened his mouth as a platitude on his tongue, but he closed it again. "No," he said finally. I don't." Lulu's face darkened, baring her teeth. She struggled to her feet, and that's when Jay realized she was transparent, like a ghost. Was she like that just a moment ago? He didn't think so. Even as he watched, she grew dimmer, fading. Suddenly, an axe was in her hands. "If you try to leave me, I'll kill you," she raged. She made no attempt to step forward. The threat struck Jay's heart, but he knew, even as it filtered through him, that it was empty. She wouldn't. She couldn't. "No, you won't," he sadly sighed. "You're just a ghost." He turned away and added, his heart breaking, "And I'm done with you." Lulu let out a shriek. Then Jay closed his eyes and listened to it linger, then dissolve, like the volume of a radio being slowly turned down. Then silence ruled. He looked over his shoulder. Lulu Roswell was gone. And that's it for tonight. If you have any stories you would like narrated on the channel, then please submit them to Reddit r/homeofscares and follow me on Twitter at homeofscares. If you liked tonight's creepy stories, then don't forget to click the like button and subscribe for more. Now, good night, my little hellhounds.